not a good place to stop and you want to stop sooner or later, tell us.
Okay.
Okay, good, thanks. All right, let's go.
Okay, so I was talking about the definition of farming and the definition of forestry. So the definition of farming under Act 250, I can read it to you if you'd like to hear the elements. All right, so for purposes of Act 250 and the other statutes that cite it, including the RAPS, farming means the cultivation and other use of land for growing food, fiber, Christmas trees, maple sap, or horticultural and orchard crops. And the raising, feeding, and management of livestock, poultry, fish, or bees. The definition of livestock under Act 250 is extremely long, so very encompassing. The operation of greenhouses, the production of maple syrup, the on-site storage, preparation, and sale of agricultural products principally produced on the farm, the on-site storage, preparation, production, and sale of fuel or power from agricultural products or wastes principally produced on the farm, so like a digester, the raising, feeding, and management of 4 or more equines owned or boarded by the farmer, the importation of 2,000 cubic yards per year or less of food residuals or food processing residuals on a farm for the production of compost.
Is there anything that is not in the definition that might be of interest to us that's come up before as, this is farming? No, it's not, according to the definition.
I'm the wrong person to ask.
Okay.
I am not an expert on agriculture. I think that list is pretty long, but I'm sure someone could think of something else. I think that you may hear someone argue that accessory on-farm businesses should actually be considered part of farming. That is a complicated conversation, I think, but I'm sure it will come up.
Yes.
Just following up on that, do you have the forestry definition handy or not? Because there's a pretty big different, like a sawmill is not forestry.
Right.
Unless it's principally, is there a principal part of that too? Like if you're sawing your own wood that's principally harvested on your own land, is that then considered forestry?
No, and I don't have the forestry definition in front of me. It's forestry and logging. So I know, so it is the cutting of the trees. There are some additional provisions in here related to the next step, which is the processing of the wood. And so I don't have that offhand. But there is a partial exemption in here for those who process wood into. So there's a small sawmill exemption in here, and then also last year there was a provision to go a step further for wood products manufacturers. So those who take already processed wood products and make them into something else. So there's a couple of steps in the process. So I think primarily forestry refers to the actual sawing of the logs. I don't think there's I don't know, but I don't think there's a requirement about actually owning the land. I think it's for the loggers themselves.
Representative Rice, and then, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sort of a similar question, getting to is processing included? I noticed that what you said is maple sap, and so like our sugaring operations that are turning sap into syrup included in the definition.
Yes.
And I guess, and you don't probably have the answer to that, but like why then is sugaring different from, say, brewing or distilling or things that have sort of come up as?
Because so I think distilling that's just what the definition is. So That's how it's been defined.
The policy decision.
Yeah.
We've made that decision, rightly or wrongly. The legislature has over the years by
Yeah. And I
finding it
think
that way.
part of that is that so turning maple sap into syrup involves an entirely a commodity that's taken entirely from the source and turned into something, whereas distilling and brewing requires the addition of other ingredients that may or may not have been actually produced on the farm. And so it really is the amount of the product produced on the farm. You're allowed to process the commodities grown on the farm.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to make a little clarification with regard to Representative Henry Pearl's question. Logging is quite regulated, even though it's under an agricultural use. The regulation most critical is around water quality, impacts on water quality. And whether you're doing a harvest on a 3-acre parcel or a 300-acre parcel, you can trip violations of acceptable management practices, which is the newest high standard. And there's no exemption from violating those standards. And you're exempt from Act 250 up to a certain acreage in terms of clear cuts, and that may be over 40 acres. Then you will trigger a review from the Agency of Natural Resources, not necessarily Act 250.
I think we're definitely going to take some time to dig deeper into the weeds here too on both pieces. So yeah, I don't feel that we need to get all of the details down, but yeah.
Yes, I wanted to just touch base on your question about is there anything that you might not consider to be farming that intersects with Act 250? And something that we had discussed last year was what is accessory to the farm, and what happens when your accessory on-farm business is producing more than the farm itself financially. Mm-hmm. And you run into those instances when you talk about agritourism and folks wanting to offer cabins to stay for the entire immersion of a farm experience. And what if those are making more? So there was just so much in-depth conversation of what is accessory? What does that mean? So that is a challenge within that conversation.
Other questions, Representative O'Brien?
Connected to that, Ellen, I just had a question about who applies for Act 250. It's voluntary, right? But there's so much confusion, right, with accessory on-farm business or agritourism, just in what we deal with. But is it? I mean, you can apply if you have a very good idea, right? You're going to trigger something. But is it also complaint-driven, or does the NRB, in their travels around, sometimes be like, there's a wing going on this sugar house that clearly is, potentially not, exempt.
Yeah. So if you're going to construct something on your property, it is advisable to at least check to see if just by looking at the statute, you're going to trigger Act 250. That is advisable if you're going to do any kind of construction and you own more than 1 acre of land, unless it's purely for your own purely residential use. So yes, it's hard for me to say that it's voluntary, because if you do not get a permit and you build something for a business, there will be enforcement, and it could result in the loss of you being unable to use that wing, or some kind of steep penalty for that. So if you're doing construction, you should start there before you do any construction. The NRB has some helpful flow charts. I'm going to do this. Do I need a permit? There can be complaint-driven issues. So yes, the NRB has a few enforcement officers. So if they receive a complaint, I think someone has built something without a permit, they do have people that investigate. There's also something called a jurisdictional opinion that anyone can apply for. So anyone a landowner or not a landowner can ask the NRB if something requires an Act 250 permit. And so that can be something that is in development, like being prepared, or it could be something that's already been built. So a common thing that happens is, especially for affordable housing developers, there is an exemption for affordable housing under Act 250, but it is specific. You need to meet the qualifications of the affordability. So often affordable housing developers have to go to Act 250 and ask for a jurisdictional opinion saying, is this project as I've designed it exempt from Act 250? Yes or no? That decision can be appealed, but anyone can request one of those also. So people who are concerned that something is being built without an Act 250 permit can request a jurisdictional opinion.
And then what happens in repurposing something, a sugar house gets turned into a restaurant, or the Rygate power plant wants to switch the fuels it's using, something like that. I mean, does something already existing trigger?
We're not talking about Rygate today. Act 250 jurisdiction is perpetual. It runs with the land. So once an Act 250 permit has been issued for a parcel, it remains there, except for in perpetuity forever, even if the property changes hands, unless there's some very specific carve-outs for, but 98% of permits are perpetual and run with the land. And so yes, if in the future you make a change and there's an Act 250 permit on the parcel, you will need to ask the NRB if you need a permit amendment.
Isn't energy exempt from 250?
Yes, the electric generation facilities are exempt from Act 250. However, that exemption was only added in I'm going to get it wrong, the 90s. And so I don't remember off the top of my head if Rygate actually has one. But if the Rygate power plant had an Act 250 permit and they wanted to make a significant change to the use, yes. And there is a standard. It's whether or not there has been a material change to the operation of the building or whatever it is. So de minimis changes within the site that's already been built are allowed to go forward without an amendment.
Representative Rice?
Where does on-farm farm worker housing fit in? Is it in the definition of farming? Great
Question. Housing, the construction of housing for under Act 250 generally, the construction of 10 or more units of housing is its own jurisdictional trigger. So if they were to put up a significant constructed building that has 10 or more individual units within it, that would trigger Act 250 on its own. I don't know the answer off the top of my head if there's been rulings before on if housing for workers is separate from farming. Within the farming exemption, there is a further caveat that if a farmer does construct something that is deemed to not be farming, an Act 250 jurisdiction attaches, that the attachment of the jurisdiction is limited to the precise part of the parcel that is not specifically farming. I could do this all day. Just examples. So there are other parts of criteria 9 that I'll just go over very quickly because it's already past 10. Productive forest soils, like primary agricultural soils, also need to be protected. So there's a standard for that. Earth resources, which is the development or extraction of minerals from the soil, that's a criterion. And there's 2 elements to that. It's, are you damaging any of the minerals in the soil that could be extracted? And are you preserving the land that could be used for mining or, are you preserving it for future use? There's also energy conservation is under Act 250. If you're constructing a building, you need to meet the high energy standard we have in statute. Private utility service, are you going to be relying on utility service and have you accounted for that? Scattered development, you need to limit strip development and sprawl. So there's demonstration that you are not contributing to that. Impacts on the public utility service, development affecting public investment. Are you going to have negative impacts on any of the public investments, which is a long list of things. Settlement patterns, which is also related to sprawl and urban development outside of existing village and urban centers. All right, so those are all of the criteria. And then once you make your application, the commission has the ability to either approve, deny, or approve with conditions. And the conditions have to be tied to mitigating any sort of impact you've had on one of those criterion. So they're not related to just, we don't want this business to operate in a certain way, but they have to find that there's been some kind of impact. And so one of the ones I didn't mention but comes up under two separate is noise. So noise is part of the air pollution criterion as well as the aesthetics criterion and sometimes part of the traffic criterion. So have you done anything to mitigate that? Okay. That's like just the permit. There are other elements, obviously appeals and things like that. So.
Right. Okay. Well, let's get a few questions in here, and then would that be a sort of a good place to pause, to stop for the day or for the session, and then not the
Session, yeah, I mean.
She's ready to get rid of us.
I will have you back in. We will have you back in within a day or two if there's. I think there's more that you were hoping to present. So.
Oh, sure, we can talk about it. Yeah.
Okay. I think Representative O'Brien had his hand up, and then Representative Lipsky.
Oh, and I just wondered, because at some point when you come back, it'd be great to use the whole Franklin County Airport, which I think you worked on. As whether it was exempt or not and all those things, but does the state have to apply for Act 250 or the national forest here if they build something? So if you could just talk about potential where other exemptions are, or does everybody have to follow this law?
Everybody, including the state. And the feds with the forest, it's a little bit different, but in general, the feds and the state do have to comply. And so all of the airports do have Act 250 permits.
And if it's private, it's not like, is it a trigger on commercial, or if it's just somebody building a house, that doesn't necessarily do it?
There are 10 individual jurisdictional triggers of things that you could do beyond commercial businesses. So state projects do have an individual trigger, municipal projects as well. Individual residential only triggers Act 250 if it's above 2,500 feet in elevation. Otherwise, individually constructed homes do not trigger Act 250. Private developers putting in more than 10 units of housing do trigger Act 250.
And then is it, if it's, say the Vermont Food Bank builds something, gives food away, so it's not, the not-for-profit, is that?
Oh my gosh, we could talk about this for hours. So the definition of commercial development here is actually a little bit more expansive than you probably think. It does include churches. So commercial doesn't necessarily mean for a dollar value. It is the exchange of things for any kind of value, whether it's donation-based or service-based. So things, including churches, have been found to be for a commercial purpose. So it's more than just a store.
Like schools, fairgrounds, all those things would fall under it.
Yes, there are some exemptions for fairgrounds because we like them a lot. But schools do trigger Act 250, yes.
Wow.
Things that existed prior to 1970, Act 250 was enacted in 1970. So things that predate Act 250 are exempt until a major change is made.
Did you?
Just comment to you and to our guests. I think for all of our collective constituents, the knowledge we're gaining from your presentations is very important.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you.
I would look forward to
I agree.
continued dialogue and thank you.
Did anybody else have a question? While we have, yeah, okay, great. Well, yes, I was gonna say, even though Act 250 is not our primary, I mean, we don't have primary jurisdiction over it. It's very helpful to hear this because the fact that we do touch it means that we all will have to have a pretty good understanding of what it, what it means, even when it doesn't apply to the work that we're doing. So why don't we stop there? We will be back in touch to have you come in because I think and at the very least, just to hear more about the accessory on-farm business question and maybe some other questions and anything more that you want to